Back in October 1991, someone went missing in a small town called Absley in Ontario, Canada. Her family didn't know what happened to her for over 30 years. On October 7, 1991, a 40-year-old woman named Angeline Josephine Quinnell disappeared near a city called Peterborough. Her family got really worried when she didn't come home, so they told the police she was missing on October 9th. That's 2 days after anyone last saw her. The police looked everywhere for her, but they couldn't find her anywhere. A month later, on November 10th, someone found her car in an old quarry that nobody used anymore. It was near Ridge Road and Highway 620, east of a place called Cohill. They found some of her things nearby, but still no sign of where Angeline was. Then 5 days after that, on November 15th, a person who was hunting found Angeline's body on McCoy Bay Road. The doctors who checked her body said someone had killed her. For many years, nobody knew who did it, and her family was so sad and confused. The Ontario Provincial Police kept trying to solve the case, but they couldn't figure it out, and the case got really cold. Her mom, Maria Quinnell, never gave up looking for answers. Maria said, "We've been living without knowing what happened for so long, not knowing what happened to our daughter or why someone took her away from us." The police never gave up on the case either, and they really wanted to find out the truth. Over the years, they looked at the case again when they got better ways to solve crimes. But it wasn't until 2025, more than 30 years later, that they finally figured it out. On June 19, 2025, a 70-year-old man named David Alexander Snow got arrested for killing Angeline. Snow was already in prison for life because he killed 2 other people named Ian and Nancy Blackburn in 1992. After years of detective work, they connected him to Angeline's case too. He had a history of hurting people, and the police finally figured out he was the one who did it. People called Snow the house hermit. A detective named Sean Gulford said, "Snow's history of violence and our detective work led us to arrest him." He also said, "This arrest is a really important step toward getting justice for Angeline's family and everyone in the community." For Angeline's family, hearing about the arrest made them feel happy and sad at the same time. They were glad the case was moving forward, but it also brought back painful memories. Maria, her mom, said, "I'm happy we finally have some answers, but it doesn't bring her back. It's hard to believe after all these years." The police never giving up on the case showed how important it is to keep trying. A police officer named Joe Breeze said, "Even when we didn't have any new clues, we knew we had to keep going." Angeline deserved justice, and her family deserved to know what happened. David Snow getting arrested after years of not knowing brought some peace to Angeline Quinnell's case, but it also made people wonder if he hurt other people too. Since he had hurt people before, many wondered how many others might have been hurt by him too. The police's hard work plus new ways of solving crimes finally connected Snow to Angeline's death, which made the community of Absley feel much better. People in the town said, "It's been a really long wait for justice, but now we can finally start to feel better." For Angeline's family, arresting the bad guy didn't make the pain go away, but it did make them feel like justice was happening. Maria said, "It's both happy and sad at the same time. We waited for so long, but knowing someone will be punished for her death brings us some peace." Snow, who was already in prison, now has to go to court for what he did to Angeline, which is another big part of his criminal story. For Angeline's family, the court case is just another step in their long fight for justice. Angeline's case shows us how police officers never give up and always try to get justice for victims. It also shows us the sad truth that families often have to wait many years to find out what happened to their loved ones. But with Snow getting arrested, Angeline's family can finally breathe easier, knowing the person who killed her will face punishment. As the case moves forward, the community of Absley, Ontario, can finally start to heal. Even though nothing can bring Angeline back, the hard work of the police and the strength of her family made sure that the person who hurt her will finally get punished for what he did. In May 1999 in Washington, D.C., a 24-year-old woman was found dead in her apartment at 416 F Street Northeast. Someone had stabbed her 13 times in her bedroom with a knife. On May 21st, Susan Noel Svenross's roommate found the terrible scene when she came home that evening. The apartment door wasn't locked and a window in Susan's bedroom was open. Susan had moved to D.C. to start her career, and everyone knew her for being kind and loving animals. She had just started working at a place that takes care of animals that don't have homes. Her life was just starting when someone violently ended it, leaving her family heartbroken and everyone wondering why this happened for many years. The case really puzzled the detectives. The crime scene didn't have much evidence, and there were no people they thought might have done it right away. Even though they talked to lots of people and tried really hard to find clues, the case got cold. As time went by, people almost forgot about Susan's case. But her sad family and the DC police never gave up trying to solve it. Even though it seemed impossible, the DC Metropolitan Police Department never quit. They kept the case open and looked at it again whenever they found new evidence or got better ways to solve crimes. Even though many years passed, the case was still important to them, and they hoped that someday they would get justice. In 2012, after 10 years of nothing happening, the case got attention again because of new DNA testing technology. This led to a breakthrough, but not right away. During this time, the detectives looked at the evidence again and started to think. Susan's case was connected to a man named George Mudd. Mudd wasn't someone they suspected at first, but in 2012, while he was in jail for other crimes, they talked to him about the case. During the interview, Mudd said he didn't know Susan and said he had nothing to do with her case. He also couldn't explain why his DNA was found where the crime happened. But then something big happened when DNA testing showed that Mudd's DNA matched the samples they took from Susan's body. Finding this out was a huge breakthrough, but it would take more years before Mudd would get arrested and charged with the crime. The DNA evidence was very clear. Mudd was involved in her death. Even though the evidence was strong, his lawyers kept saying he didn't mean to hurt anyone, suggesting that maybe his DNA got there from a normal encounter. However, this argument was quickly thrown out when the detectives found a pattern of violent behavior. Mudd's criminal past became a really important part of the investigation. In 2004, Mudd had attacked another woman, stabbing her after she was nice to him. This attack involved using a knife, and the way Mudd acted was very similar to what happened in Susan's case. The pattern of violence was clear. Mudd had a history of attacking women, and Susan was just another victim of his cruelty. When Mudd got arrested in 2025, 26 years after Susan died, all those years of investigation finally paid off. The case was solved, but justice came at a really high price. Susan's family had gone through years of not knowing what happened. The wait for justice was really long, and while Mudd getting arrested brought some relief, it didn't make the pain of losing her any easier. Susan's sister said, "I never thought this day would come. It's a weird feeling. We're thankful that someone is finally being held responsible, but it doesn't bring her back." The impact on the DC community was also really big. Susan's death had left a mark, and seeing the case solved brought both closure and sadness that wouldn't go away. Lieutenant Keith Batten, who worked with the DC police, said, "Our technology has grown so much from 1999 to now. Using DNA technology was really important in solving the case." And Batten said he hoped other old cases could be solved using similar methods. As the case went on, Mudd kept saying he didn't do it. However, all the evidence against him painted a very clear picture. The prosecutors showed his violent criminal history, and the DNA evidence proved his role in the case. While Mudd said he didn't commit the crime, his past suggested he was lying. The evidence pointed to violence that was planned ahead of time. In the end, the court decided there was enough evidence to charge Mudd, and he was held in jail without bail. He will appear back in court on July 30th. For Susan's family, the arrest was both happy and sad. Her mother said Susan had dreams, and she was just starting her life. It's not just about justice. It's about remembering who she was and what she could have accomplished. Arresting George Mudd didn't undo the pain of losing Susan, but it brought a sense of closure to her family. Susan's case reminds us how powerful it is to never give up on solving old cases. Technology and DNA testing, which didn't exist when Susan was killed, played a huge role in bringing the person who hurt her to justice. Even though it took many years to solve this case, the police and Susan's family never stopped trying. In July 2020, a pregnant woman got shot. It took years for the truth to come out. On July 31st, 2020 in Columbia, Maryland, a 30-year-old woman named Rabia Ahmad got shot while she was inside a house on Dovecote Drive. Rabia, who was 28 weeks pregnant, got hit by a bullet that someone fired from outside the house. The police thought someone shot multiple bullets into the house as a warning for two people he was fighting with, not necessarily people who lived there. But the bullet hit Rabia, so they had to rush her to the hospital where doctors had to deliver her baby girl, AA. Sadly, AA died just 5 days later. When she died, Rabia had only been living in Maryland for a few months. She had just moved to the area and was staying at that house temporarily. Even though this is how she died, the police thought Rabia was not the person the shooter was trying to hit. However, her life was taken in a senseless act of violence, and both she and her unborn daughter were lost in an instant. Rabia's family, who were devastated by losing their daughter and granddaughter, spoke out after the shooting. Rabia's mother, Jamila Ahmad, said, "You destroyed my life. You took my joy, my daughter, and my granddaughter." The sadness and pain of losing someone you love, especially in such a violent and unexpected way, was made worse by not knowing who was responsible for this terrible act. For years, the case went cold. Even though the police tried really hard, they didn't have any immediate leads, and the person who killed Rabia was still out there. The Howard County Police Department kept investigating, but the answers they desperately wanted seemed impossible to find. For Rabia's family, the waiting was unbearable. They lived with constant pain from not knowing who was responsible for their loved ones' deaths. But then on April 9th, 2025, almost 5 years after the shooting, the case took a big turn. The police arrested a 31-year-old man named Edward Robinson from Colombia, charging him with 2 counts of first-degree murder in connection with the deaths of Rabia Ahmad and her unborn daughter. Robinson, who had a criminal history, was already known to the police for his violent behavior. He was arrested in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and was held in jail without bail at the Howard County Detention Center. Robinson getting arrested happened after a really thorough investigation that was eventually given to the Howard County Police Cold Case Unit in September 2023. After looking at the case again and getting a tip from someone who didn't give their name, the detectives connected Robinson to the shooting. They found out that Robinson had been in a fight with 2 people at the Dovecote Drive house, and they thought the gunfire was meant as a warning for them. Sadly, Rabia got caught in the middle. Testing the bullets showed they matched the type of gun found in Robinson's home, and they were doing more tests to see if it was the exact weapon used. Rabia's family, who had waited years for answers, felt happy and sad at the same time when they heard about Robinson getting arrested. Jamila, Rabia's mother, said, "It's bittersweet. We're glad they found him, but nothing will bring them back." Even though the arrest brought some closure, the sadness of losing Rabia and her unborn daughter was still there. Howard County Police Chief Gregory Dare praised the detectives for their hard work that never stopped. Dare said, "Our detectives never rest until they get justice for a grieving family." The case, which had been unsolved for almost 5 years, was finally on the path toward being resolved, showing that justice can still happen even after years of waiting. After this arrest, there's been more focus on unsolved cases in Howard County. Local officials, including Howard County Executive Calvin Ball, have talked about how important it is to solve old cases and bring closure to grieving families. Ball said, "We're committed to making sure every person feels safe." Rabia and her daughter Az's lives were taken way too soon. But with this arrest, we're one step closer to bringing justice for them. Rabia's case reminds us of the dangers of violence and what happens when disagreements aren't resolved peacefully. Her tragic death and the loss of her unborn daughter are something her family will never forget. Rabia Ahmad's shooting case shows the strength of a community coming together to seek justice. It's a story of heartbreak, strength, and never giving up on finding answers. Rabia's family and the Howard County community can finally begin to heal, knowing that the person who took her life will face justice. In August 2008 in Jacksonville, Arkansas, an 18-year-old got shot and killed. Almost 2 decades after the crime, there was finally a breakthrough. Danik Adams was just starting to figure out her life when something terrible happened. On August 15th, as Danik and her friend were walking to her car after leaving the gym, a person wearing a mask came up to them. The masked person shot Danik multiple times, badly hurting her, then stole her car and ran away. Her friend was terrified and immediately called 911, but Danik's injuries were too bad. She died before the paramedics could get there. Danik had just graduated from high school and had big dreams for her future. Everyone knew her for her bright smile and her kind heart. Her family and friends talked about how much potential she had, how she planned to go to college and someday help other people. But that future was taken from her in a split second. Her death affected the whole community, leaving friends, family, and even strangers trying to understand why something so senseless happened. Even though the police tried hard to find the person who did it at first, they didn't have much to work with. The only clue they had was the stolen car, but that didn't lead them to the killer. The case eventually went cold. For almost 17 years, nobody knew who killed Danik, leaving her family and the Jacksonville community without answers. Detective Cindy Harbour, who had worked on the case early on, refused to let everyone forget about it. After she retired in 2021, Harbour came back to work on the case as a volunteer officer, determined to bring closure to a family that was left grieving and in pain. Her dedication would eventually pay off. In June 2025, a man named Lavelle Diario Calvin from Memphis got arrested in connection with her case. The case details were kept secret, but the arrest was a moment of huge relief for Danik's family. Danik's mother, Amy, said, "I've always prayed that there would be an answer one day." For years, Amy had struggled with the heartbreaking unknowns of the case. The pain of losing her daughter never got easier, but the news of an arrest brought some sense of closure. Calvin wasn't immediately thought of as a suspect, but his criminal history, including other violent crimes he'd committed before, caught the police's attention. Even though they questioned him in 2012, he said at first that he had no connection to the crime. Looking into Calvin's background showed a man with a violent history, someone who had committed multiple crimes against women in the past. Calvin's history painted a clear picture of a man who was capable of violence. But the investigation needed more than just suspicion. They needed solid proof. As the case moved forward, Danik's family thought about her life and the loss they had gone through. The grieving process was made much harder by the years of not knowing what happened. But even after her death, Danik's memory lived on. Her family was determined to see justice served. Amy said, "I'm just so thankful and so happy, but at the same time, I just want to scream and cry." Danik's father, still struggling with the pain, said, "We waited so long. We thought we would never get an answer." What started with one woman reporting someone trying to kidnap her led to uncovering a violent history that lasted 20 years, one marked by brutal attacks and lasting trauma. Decades later, a man stood in front of a Newcastle, Australia court, facing justice for a crime he committed as a teenager in 1980. In early 1980, a man targeted a 16-year-old girl in Gateshead, Australia. He followed her from a movie theater bus stop, grabbed her around the waist, and threatened her with a knife, ordering her to get into his car. He planned to sexually assault her, but the girl managed to escape into nearby bushes. At the time, she didn't report what happened. It would be decades before this attempted kidnapping came up again in connection to a bigger investigation. In 2023, after watching a TV documentary about teenagers who disappeared in Lake Macquarie, the woman came forward and reported the 1980 incident. She identified Warren John McCorrin from a black and white photo lineup, picking him out from 20 pictures. Her report prompted renewed efforts by Strike Force Arapima, which had previously investigated suspected crimes in the area. As a result, McCorriston got arrested in Queensland in early 2024 and was brought to New South Wales to face the long-delayed charges. McCorrist was born in the 1960s in Newcastle, New South Wales, making him 64 years old in mid-2025. He grew up in a home that was full of problems, instability, and trauma. From when he was very young, he lived in a deeply abusive environment with his father being violent and aggressive. Being neglected was normal, and the home had problems with drug and alcohol abuse. This toxic environment shaped McCorriston's early view of the world, exposing him to violence as a regular part of life and messing up his understanding of relationships and how to express emotions. Mental health reports presented to the court painted a disturbing picture of McCorriston's childhood. He was raised in a household where fear and survival were more important than safety and support. Violence being normal and not having anyone to care for him left deep psychological scars. These reports emphasized how the trauma from his early years contributed to long-term emotional damage and a broken sense of who he was. They suggested that the patterns of abuse and chaos he saw as a child would later show up in his adult behavior. McCorriston went to school in the Newcastle and Lake Macquarie area, but dropped out in year 11 around 1979. His decision to leave school was reportedly because he needed to help support his family with money. However, leaving school at such an important time also meant losing access to positive structure and good influences. With no educational guidance and already hurt by trauma, he was left to handle adult responsibilities way too early, making the cycle of instability that began in childhood even worse. Despite these challenges, McCorriston eventually found his way into the restaurant and hotel industry. He worked his way up and had management jobs at several well-known places. His career included positions at places on the Gold Coast and at Daydream Island Resort. These achievements showed he had some level of skill and motivation, proving that he could maintain order and professionalism in his work life, even as his unresolved trauma bubbled under the surface. His ability to function in high-pressure environments hid the emotional damage that had never been dealt with. Between 1979 and 1999, McCorriston committed a series of violent sexual assaults against at least 3 women in the Newcastle and Hunter region. These attacks included sexual assault and causing serious bodily harm. One victim had broken ribs and a collapsed lung, while another was bitten twice on her back during the assault. The violence and cruelty of these crimes left lasting trauma on the victims. McCorriston eventually pleaded guilty in 2021 to these crimes, and he was sentenced to a maximum of 8.5 years in prison with a minimum time of 4.5 years before he could be released. On June 26, 2025, McCorriston appeared in Newcastle District Court, where Judge Tim Gartleman SC sentenced him to 27 months for the 1980 kidnapping attempt with a minimum time of 15 months before release. However, considering the principle of fairness and the time he'd already served, the sentence was backdated to November 8, 2023. This meant the minimum time effectively ended on February 7, 2025, and McCorriston was granted immediate release because of time he'd already served overlapping. His legal responsibility for this decades-old crime ended in court, but his restrictions didn't end there. McCorriston remains a registered sex offender under strict supervision. His parole conditions include electronic monitoring, a curfew, a ban on drinking alcohol and gambling, restrictions on entering Lake Macquarie unless required by court, and mandatory daily activity reporting. His parole for the 1980 offense continues until at least February 2026, and for the 2021 convictions until July 7, 2028. He's also getting therapeutic and psychological help. While his defense lawyers talked about his abusive childhood, how young he was when he committed the original crime, and progress he'd made in getting better, the prosecution stressed that his violent behavior continued into his late 50s with unresolved allegations still being investigated. The court noted that although he may have been less morally responsible when he was young, his rehabilitation is ongoing and he hasn't been fully held accountable yet.